This webinar is beginning right now and being recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Kenny Voss, and I will be your moderator for today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on the Clean Water Act, 404 and 401 permitting, and 408 permissions. Our goal with these webinars is to ensure employees receive the technical training necessary to successfully deliver projects in the future. I have a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started. We are scheduled for 2 hours today. This includes time for the presentation and time for questions and answers. We are recording today's webinar and will be placing the recording in Modot U for future reference. This webinar will also be added to the course catalog of the Program Delivery Training Program. All lines are muted during the presentation. The question and answer function will be open, so I encourage you to send questions to the all panelists in the chat pod. We will break after the presentation and address questions from the Q&A pod. The presenters will also be taking additional verbal questions at this time. For today's webinar, we will have several presenters. I am pleased to introduce our opening speaker, Chris Scholes, Environmental Compliance Manager in the Design Division. At this time, I will hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Kenny. At this time, I want to tell everyone welcome to this webinar. I hope that you'll learn a lot from this. We will have one break about halfway through. It'll be about 5 minutes, so you can stretch, use the restroom, grab a snack, whatever. But at this time, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen for the PowerPoint presentation. So for this training, we're going to discuss rivers, streams, ditches, lakes, ponds, wetlands, and special aquatic sites. We can also throw in there levees, core projects, and many other aspects that we have to keep in mind when we're impacting these types of resources. For those of you that like this picture of a wetland, this is the Forum Natural Area in Columbia, Missouri. Today we're going to cover many different topics. We're going to start off by talking about why wetlands and streams are important, a history and overview of wetland and stream protection, why does Modot care about wetland and stream protection, which projects need a permit, an overview of 404 and 401 permit types, important permit conditions to remember, other regulations, mitigation, and then we'll end it with important points to remember. So why are wetlands and streams important? Well, first of all, I want to introduce our friend for today, Noah, courtesy of our PowerPoint stock images, but we're going to pretend today that he's a recent engineering grad from MU, and he skipped my presentation for Dr. Kate Trouth's environmental compliance class. And so he's gotten his first RES here at Modot, and he's received responses from our specialists, and he sees that he has some wetlands and some streams on his project, and he needs to get a permit. He sees terms like IP and mitigation, and so he's wondering what's up with that. So you'll see Noah throughout the presentation today, and hopefully you'll see that his attitude changes by the time we get to the end of the presentation. Hopefully that will reflect your attitudes as well. So why are wetlands valuable? Well, they provide floodwater retention, which is a main, very important component of wetlands that are found along major rivers and streams. They provide an overflow and an area for that overflow water to be held in so that they reduce flooding in surrounding areas. Wetlands can also recharge groundwater, which is very important for wells and springs, caves, many aspects of that nature. Wetlands also provide habitat for a lot of different species that can only live in the habitats that wetlands provide. Wetlands help maintain water quality. You can think of wetlands as natural filters. On a landscape scale, wetlands help provide erosion control and they act as sediment traps. And they also provide many opportunities for education, research, and recreation, such as fishing, bird watching, kayaking. Contrary to popular belief, wetlands are not mosquito breeding habitats. If wetlands have proper functioning ecosystems with predators, mosquitoes are kept at bay. And so it's just a common misconception that wetlands provide mosquito breeding habitat. Streams are also valuable. They also improve water quality. The riparian areas or the vegetated areas along their banks also help filter the water that's running off into streams, and it also provides habitat for many species that live along rivers and streams. Like wetlands, rivers and streams also provide educational, research, and recreational opportunities such as fishing. Again, they provide habitat for many species, and they also provide economic support. Our rivers and streams are used all the time for freight transport or recreational opportunities that boost income for local communities along these watersheds. They provide continuity within the watersheds for species, for animals and plants that utilize these types of habitats. So they provide basically paths and trails for these types of animals to migrate and to find food and shelter along. So I want to talk a little bit about a history and overview of wetland and stream protections now that we know some of the values that they provide. Obviously, this is sort of an ideal picture of clean water and lush vegetation along a stream, and we strive to protect places like this, but not everything looks like this. And so, you know, many places like this in the past have become degraded or polluted. And so there's been many environmental laws, particularly in the late 1960s and early 1970s, to try to protect areas like this and ensure that they're available for future generations. So the first law that I want to talk about is quite old. It's from 1899, the Rivers and Harbors Act. And this is Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, where it's unlawful to build or begin the building of any structure in the water of the United States without authorization by the Chief of Engineers. So that's our first sort of environmental law that deals with building structures in rivers. This is a famous photo of a famous incident that occurred in 1969 in Ohio's Cuyahoga River. It was so fouled by industrial pollution that the river caught fire. What many people don't realize is that this photo was actually taken in the 1950s, and there was no photo taken of the 1969 incident. And also that the river had actually caught fire about a dozen times prior to that, starting in the middle 1800s. So we think of the 1969 fire on the Cuyahoga River as sort of being one of the main impetuses for environmental laws, but it took, you know, a dozen fires before that that were pretty much ignored before it got to this point. And surprisingly, the river even caught fire again in 2019. This is the Cuyahoga River, and what happened here was a tanker spilled on the highway adjacent to the river, and you see that drainage structure in the background. A fuel caught fire and actually poured through that box culvert and out into the river. The river wasn't on fire for very long, but it serves as a reminder that even though the river's been cleaned up and it's much better than it was in the 1960s and early 1970s, and it's sort of a poster child for environmental protection, accidents still can and do occur, and we have to be vigilant about protecting our water quality. So the Clean Water Act, this was born out of a desire to protect our nation's water quality by regulating the discharge of pollutants into waters of the United States. And that waters of the United States is in quotes because the definition of that is ever changing. This is why it's important that our office keeps up with the rules, the regulations, court cases, congressional actions, because the definition of waters of the United States dictates what is jurisdictional under the Corps' regulations and what's not. And so that translates to what you need a permit for or what you don't need a permit for. But broadly, the definition of waters of the United States includes wetlands, intermittent streams, rivers, and lakes. And the objective of this act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And that word restore is very important because it defines the fact that when we have impacts, we have to make sure that we are not just putting a Band-Aid on what we do. We have to restore these aspects of the waters, the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the waters that we impact. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, we just talk about a 404 permit generally. And this is the section of the Act that prohibits the discharge of dredged or fill materials into the waters of the U.S. without a permit from the United States Army Corps of Engineers, USACE. So in order to put any kind of fill into a water of the U.S., you have to get a permit from the Corps first. That can include cement, rock, soil, anything like that. If you're putting that into the water, you have to have a permit. Section 401 of the Clean Water Act is what we generally call the water quality section. And the EPA and the Corps have given the states authority to establish water quality standards and the authority to require water quality certification for any project needing a Section 404 permit. And the Department of Natural Resources here in Missouri, our sister state agency, establishes the Missouri's water quality standards, and they issue certifications for water quality. So generally, this is a step that we don't often have to contend with because many of our permits in here at Modot that we deal with are called nationwide permits, and we'll be talking about those here in just a little bit. And the DNR has already pre-certified a lot of those nationwide permits for water quality certification. So we don't have to go to the DNR and apply for a separate water quality certification for many of those nationwide permits because we are expected to comply with the conditions of the water quality certification associated with those permits. When we have an individual permit for a project that we need to get from the Corps of Engineers, we also need to get an individual water quality certification from the Department of Natural Resources. And that's a process that's changed recently as well, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the presentation. But just know for now that there's Section 404, which is the placement of dredge and fill material into waters of the U.S., and Section 401, which is water quality standards. So we kind of talked about this a little bit already. Required for the 401 is required from the Department of Natural Resources when an individual 404 permit is required. There is a new process that started last year, and for the nationwide permits, we have a memorandum of understanding with the DNR that pre-certifies our permits as long as we adhere to the conditions of that MOU. So why does Modot care about this? Well, for a lot of different reasons. Mainly, I guess you could say, because these are federal laws and federal regulations, and we are using a lot of federal money to build our projects. And so the laws state that in order to use those funds, we have to comply with those federal laws. So if we don't comply with those laws, we run the risk of losing our federal funding. But there's a lot of other different reasons too. I mean, just protecting the environment, being good stewards, being good neighbors to those around us. Those all benefit the citizens of Missouri. So which projects need a permit? So now our friend Noah, he's kind of gotten the idea now that he has to comply with the law and knows why wetlands and streams are important. So he just wants to know what projects do I have to worry about that need a permit? So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Hamilton. He is the environmental specialist for the St. Louis area. He deals with wetlands and threatened and endangered species in St. Louis, and he will also be taking over wetland responsibilities in the Kansas City district.
So one of the things that is often hard to determine with each project as they come through is that each project is going to be unique in its own way. So sometimes projects will come through, they might be a bridge project, they might be a road project, it might just be resurfacing, or it could be something that's as simple as signal installations. With each of those comes different difficulties, and the overview of project review is what we're going to kind of go into. Project information is received and reviewed, and then we do a desktop review, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. And then sometimes it might warrant us, depending on what we find in our desktop review, it might warrant us to go out and do a field visit. This is usually wetland delineations. It might be to look at a stream. And if we determine that we need a permit, we have to complete all the necessary paperwork in order to secure that and make sure we meet all of the qualifications. So the RES is a request for environmental services. This is something that we see on all of our STIP projects as they come through. We'll usually get them in the location conceptual stage, and then as the project progresses, the more we find out as far as planning, we'll start to get into preliminary plans, right of way, and then final design. Early on, it's kind of showing, you know, what is the project going to look like? What might it involve? Where is it going to be? But we don't really necessarily know where we're going to have right-of-way impacts or where the laydowns are going to be for the project work. Maintenance projects may use RES system, but usually involve phone call, emails to one of us, depending on the district. While we go through these RESs, we like to see right-of-way acreage, how much and where those impacts are going to be. We like to ask for photos, maps, and plans. We like to ask for KMZ files. Those are files that are meant for Google Earth, so we can actually go kind of take a look at it before we actually get there, and that's something we're gonna show you too. And then also in the RES, we're going to talk about how we like to get information if there's any changes since the last RES was submitted. This photo is at the I-435 median wetlands near the Kansas City International Airport in Clay County. So if we determine that the project is in fact going to impact a jurisdictional stream or wetland, we need to determine which 404 permit is appropriate for the project's impacts. Once that's been determined, we must submit permit paperwork to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So in this, we're looking at bridge and low water crossing replacements, maintenance work, culvert extensions, replacements, bank stabilization, new road construction, or system expansion. Road resurfacing, guardrail replacements, and other similar jobs would not require 404 permitting because they only involve existing road surface and do not involve placement of material in streams or wetlands. bridge and low water crossing replacements and repair would need some sort of 404 permitting. There's different permits, culvert extensions, replacements, bank stabilization, shoulder work, and then, as I said before, new alignments. So the desktop review is something that a lot of people don't necessarily know how we get this information. We look at many things. We actually are going to have a video that we're going to go into. This location that we're looking at right here on this map, I selected out because I thought it would be a good location to look at because it has multiple resources. It's kind of just a very populated map, and it really does show all the resources that we are taking a look at on ArcMap, one of our programs. This is Wayne County Route 34. In this location, we have mussels, regional conditions, priority watersheds, wetlands. So for perennial streams, we'll see solid blue lines. For intermittent and ephemeral streams, you would see dotted and dashed lines on these maps. Any stream shown on a topo map, blue line stream is what we call them. And what we see here in this map would be considered a jurisdictional water. For wetlands, you can see there's different types of colors on that map, and that kind of just shows which wetlands are in the project area. There's different classifications for those. And this is called the NWI, or the National Wetlands Inventory. So we are going to now go into the desktop review. This is a video that we pre-recorded, and it's meant to kind of show you the whole process when reviewing a project. Unfortunately, you may not be able to see some of this text in here, but you'll still be able to get the general gist of how we go through a desktop review.
So for today, we wanted to show you kind of the RES, the Request for Environmental Services. These are forms that come out every time we get a new project. Up here, you'll find the information that the project has. So we have the project job number, we have the county and the route and street, and then we have our due dates here. So we have this location, the Black River, and we've chosen this location because it has a lot of special resources that we thought would be really, really great to show you guys. So here we have bridge replacement, and it involves bridge J0935. And then down here in the project description, we have bridge replacement over the Black River. We have new right-of-way easements, and then we have what the consultant is proposing to do at this location. This is kind of just a way to get an idea of what the project is going to be all about. And as we kind of advance down through here, we have project manager information, and then who created this RES specifically. As the RES progresses, we'll have this area right here, changes to the project since the last RES submittal. And the person who fills this out has the option to check yes or no. If they check no, that means that nothing has changed and we can continue on to the next thing. If they check yes, normally there's going to be a description that will say what changed, and that'll further help us out with information that we might need to go into review on. So another thing that we look at, not for the Clean Water Act side, but acres of tree clearing, that's more focused on the threatened and endangered species side. Here we have each section split out for known concerns that the district might provide, and they can put in whatever text they choose that they think might help us with the review. Down here, we'll find project plans and maps, KMZ files, which are Google Earth files that'll help us go down to the project area and kind of see the layout. And then here are our sections where we respond to the project in various ways. And each specialist has their field of expertise. We're really just going to focus on this one right here, section 404, 401. Wetland impact is what we call it, but it's all encompassing. So in here, you'll see that one of our specialists filled out this RES response. So the environmental response is what our section has to say about this. You can see in the text here that there's spawning restriction dates, and we're going to look at that later. There might be need for mitigation, where the mitigation can be achieved, information about what happens if a certain alignment might be chosen, and then the environmental action section, we talk about if we're going to delineate wetlands that might be in the area, if we're going to go out and take a look at stream conditions, take a look at the area just to get a better idea. And then the district action section, we talk about attaching a KMZ file for this specific request. A KMZ file, once again, is a Google Earth file, and that's usually something that's going to give us more information. So the district action section is very important. It's what we're asking of the district to help us further investigate what needs to be done on the project. So that in a nutshell is what the RES is all about. The next step is to go ahead and take the information that we're given. For this one, it's a bridge. So we go ahead and highlight this bridge. And we're going to go off to Google Earth. We enter the bridge projects or the bridge number here, and we click in and we zoom straight into the project area. So what's really nice about this is that it actually provides us with a little bit more information on this bridge, when it was built, when it was rehabbed, the location. What's really nice about that is we can take the location and then we can bring it into ArcMap, which we will go into next. But first off, what we see here is kind of just a preliminary view of the project area. What we have here are some layers that show that these are jurisdictional streams as recognized by the Corps of Engineers. There's not a whole lot to look at here, but you can go ahead and typically drop down and take a look at a street view. And sometimes these are outdated. This one has been updated in December of 2016, so it's pretty clear. Some of the older ones in the late 2000s are pretty grainy and not too great to look at. So this is kind of the preliminary way that we take a look at the project area before we even visit it. So next, what we're going to do, and I've already taken the coordinates and put them into ArcMap, is we hop on over here to this program. And what this program does is it gives us even more detail than we had in Google Earth. So there are several databases that we have access to. There are multiple layers that we take a look at regarding information that might be useful to us in the project area. So we have things like priority watersheds, we have wetlands, we have our streams coming through here, we have species records, we have springs. There's lots of resources in this project area, and that's why we've chosen it to show as an example. So one of the first things that we do when we come into the project area is we start identifying things using our Identifier tool, which is right up here in our toolbar. So we click on that. The first thing I'm going to take a look at here is this shaded area. This is what's called a priority watershed, and we'll talk about more about priority watersheds later in the presentation. So what we see here is not necessarily in the project area, but near the project area is the Mackenzie Creek priority watershed. And then there's some information that tells you about the watershed. Existing watershed initiative up Mackenzie and to include heritage on main stem. So not very useful information, but it does tell us that that exists there and there is something that we might need to do if we're going to be impacting within this zone. And the next thing that we do, especially when there's a big cluster of things here, is there's way too many things to take a look at. So we like to go ahead and select down to the exact layer that we want to look at. One of the things I'm going to go to first is section 303D impaired streams. When we re-identify, it goes straight down to that layer and doesn't identify anything else. So what we're seeing here is that this segment of this stream is impaired, and all of these are stating mercury in fish tissue. Now, this is not something that we would have to contact DNR for, but it's usually indicative that there's some kind of impairment when we see this line right here with these funky colors. So we go in and see what that's all about. Right here, we have to go to Wetlands to select that. We can click in and see the type of wetland that we have here. It's classified as an upland wetland, but it's an indicator that there may be wetlands in the project area. And I'm going to now zoom in because we have so many things in this area. So what we see in the immediate project area are multiple dots along this river, and that would be species records. These are records that were taken in the past, and we're able to take a look and see what those records are. I'm not able to show you what these records are, but it's another way that we can tell that maybe this might need a little bit more review than somewhere that doesn't have records. And records found at an area like this would typically warrant the need for a pre-construction notification to the Corps. Back into the Identifier tool. Once again, we're going to go and find our streams. And then this will allow us to identify what streams are in the area. So there's multiple streams coming in here. And the streams layer doesn't show you what the names are. However, the state rivers will let you know that these are streams entering the Black River. And the Black River is the one that we're concerned with. That is where our bridge crossing is. So those are essentially the fundamentals of identifying what you might have in the area. So what we have here is a sensitive stream that has wetlands in the area. There's also other things that we need to look out for, and these are called regional conditions. So these are things that would put spawning restrictions on this stream, so work couldn't occur at this location during a certain time. So what we're going to do is go back into the identifier tool, and we're going to select our regional condition 2 layer. Our regional condition 2 layer is going to show us streams in the area that have regional conditions. So what's showing up here is the Black River has Regional Condition 2 restrictions, spawning restrictions, between February 1st and June 15th. So those restrictions would prevent us from working below the ordinary high water mark during that time. And because there are these species along here, it's usually a good indicator that there's also another type of regional condition on there. We call this Regional Condition 7. So this is a sensitive aquatic species water. Under Regional Condition 7, we can see that there are species in this area that we need to be concerned with. The sensitive aquatic species in this area would need to go through consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And as part of that, we would have to also notify the Corps of impacts to this area so they may review it as well. So now that we've taken a look at everything in the project area, we now can formulate these responses that you saw in the RES. That's how we come up with our responses. There are other ways if we are, we're curious about finding a little bit more about these projects and what might be in these areas. We can take a look at the topo maps using the USGS topo viewer. And on this website, we have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regional supplement areas. I took the project area down to Leeper, Missouri, which is very close to where we just looked at. This is the Eastern Mountains and Piedmont region. The state of Missouri has several of these supplement areas, so we take a look at this website to figure out which wetland forms we need to use when screening a project. And here's a view of the state of Missouri. We can also look at soils on the USDA Web Soil Survey. And if you take a look off to the left here, there's all these records here for the types of soils that exist in the project area. We also look at the National Levee Database to see if we need to enter Section 408 review. And Section 408 review is entered if we are impacting projects that were federally constructed. So if we have a project on a river that might have been federally channelized or a drainage ditch that might have been federally constructed, we would have to notify the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and enter 408 review to make sure that they agree with our impacts and they don't have any special conditions that they may attach to our projects. And then we can also take a look at stream gauges. And those are there's a bunch of tools that we use. I wanted to just run you guys through all of those just to show everything that we look at. It's a lot of information, but these are the things that we use to formulate our responses when we get these projects.
All right, thanks, Chris, for providing that great overview of the online review that we do for Modot projects when we're looking at Section 404 permitting and waters of the U.S. So since we started the webinar, we've talked a lot about why wetlands and streams are important and about the development of laws and regulations that protect these resources and how we identify those on desktop reviews. But now I'm going to kind of go into the process of in the field identification of these resources and how we determine jurisdictional water of the U.S. So looking at this slide, it talks about the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, and essentially the Navigable Waters Protection Rule is a regulation that came out that defines and provides 4 clear categories of waters of the U.S. and that are under federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act, and those are territorial seas and navigable waters, tributaries, lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters and adjacent wetlands. So one of the so the first one, territorial seas and traditional navigable waters, are essentially the nation's navigable waters that provide a channel for commerce and transportation of people and goods. So pretty much anything that you can float a canoe in or traverse and convey those people or goods is considered a navigable water. And a territorial sea is essentially, examples of these would be the Mississippi River, Great Lakes, Chesapeake Bay, and Erie Canal, and also tidally influenced water bodies that are used in interstate and foreign commerce. Under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, the streams include perennial and intermittent rivers and streams that contribute surface water flow to traditional navigable waters in a typical year. Tributaries must be perennial or intermittent, and as of August 30th, the District of Arizona U.S. Court issued a stay, essentially, of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which previously, under the 2015 rule, we'll get into kind of these definitions later on, but ephemeral streams were not considered under the this Navigable Waters Protection Rule, but with the reversal of this rule, they can be considered jurisdictional. So a lot of this stuff sounds pretty confusing, and trust me, it is. There's a lot to keep track of in our office, but staying up on these regulations is kind of what we do. Also, ditches can be considered tributaries to navigable waters or traditional territorial seas if they contribute surface water flow and satisfy the flow conditions in those features. Lakes, ponds, and impoundments are essentially what those sound like. They're jurisdictional where they contribute surface water flow, and essentially if a stream has been impounded but it still is connected, it will be considered jurisdictional. Here's an example of an ordinary high water mark, and essentially this is defined by the lack of vegetation within the channel, and you can see kind of with that line there showing where the water normally gets up to. It defines where the jurisdictional line is, essentially, for what we consider for fill below ordinary high water mark, and that's within the Corps' jurisdiction. Next slide. And here's just another example of on the Osage River in Bates County on Route M. This is just another example of where the vegetation, you can kind of see where it stops, and then it's essentially just kind of bare bank, and you can see those where water gets up to those different levels and essentially erodes away the vegetation. And something to consider also with looking at ordinary high water mark is sometimes there's vegetation within the channel, such as water willow or scouring rush, which when you're trying to say looking at a stream and there's vegetation in the channel, that doesn't mean that that's anything below that is above that is non-jurisdictional. That can still be considered jurisdictional waters of the U.S. Next slide. First of all, ephemeral streams, you can see that there's no ordinary high water, but there is a bed and a bank on this one, and this is McDonald County, I-49. Next slide. Here's some more examples of ephemeral streams on the same project area, and this was a 5-mile corridor of new highway that's currently under construction right now down in southwest Missouri. Those pictures kind of show that these streams are essentially just rainwater driven, and when it doesn't rain very often, the leaves that have fallen off the trees don't get swept away, and there's no ordinary high water mark in these photos. Here's an example of an intermittent stream. This is on the same project area, but as you can see, there is a channel kind of defined by some smaller rocks and then some pools and some flow. And you can tell that there's a bed bank in ordinary high water, and there's even flow currently in this channel. And this was considered an intermittent stream and jurisdictional and subject to Clean Water Act permitting. Here are just a few more examples, kind of what we would look at if you had like a small stream in a box culvert or something on a lettered route. If you are extending a box culvert in this situation, anything that is below that kind of, there's nothing drawn on the map or on the picture, but you can kind of imagine where that vegetation stops and the channel starts. That's where you look at for the ordinary high water mark. And in some instances, when you do a field verification, there won't be water in the channel, but that's kind of the nature of intermittent streams. They're just kind of what they are. They're called intermittent. So and here's an example of a perennial stream. This is Osage County Route 63 over the Marys River, and this stream has water in it year-round and flow year-round. And as you can see, there is some vegetation in the channel in the background. It looks like that is probably water willow, and even though that is vegetation, and there's kind of a clear defined line, if that area were to be impacted by a project, that area would probably still fall within the jurisdiction of 404 permitting. So here's kind of a interesting example of a intermittent stream that's been captured in a roadside ditch, and you can see it comes from the right side of the screen and then enters the ditch and then flows to a box culvert. And essentially this would be considered a jurisdictional stream, even though the flow is within a ditch on the roadside. It still would require a permit for any impacts in that stream. And this looks like an active project here, and it's Route 60 in Howell County. And essentially anytime you divert flow into a ditch from a jurisdictional water, that feature then becomes jurisdictional. Similarly, in this situation, there's a concrete line ditch, and this feature would likely be considered jurisdictional if it's an intermittent or perennial feature. And even though it does have concrete in the ditch, any work in those areas that do have those satisfy those flow criteria would still require a permit. And going back to that example, there was a project we had in Kansas City, I believe it was in Clay County, where a concrete line ditch essentially accumulated enough sediment to where a wetland developed on top of the concrete, and maintenance was wanting to go in and clean that out, and essentially required a 404 permit for that work, even though it was previously an impacted stream with concrete lining. And so it's not always cut and dry, and usually working with the Corps of Engineers is what we do is to try to figure out what kind of permits we need for those situations. This slide here is a picture of a jurisdictional, essentially drainage ditch down in southeast Missouri. It's Route 142 in Dunklin County. And a lot of the ditches down in the Boot Heel region are from wetlands that have been channelized and drained, and the flow essentially is confined to the channel, but would still be considered jurisdictional even though it's a constructed and man-made ditch. They were previously constructed in wetlands and still satisfy those flow criteria. So next I'm going to go into identifying wetlands as another water of the U.S. and subject to Clean Water Act permitting. Wetlands are defined as areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration that support, under normal circumstances, vegetation that is typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. So what's that saying is basically if you have enough water for long enough time, the vegetation is going to reflect that, and the soil will likely reflect that as well. And kind of the three things that we look for during the field visit is hydrophytic vegetation, hydric soils, and just presence of recent or even current water, signs of water on the area. Here's an example of an emergent wetland, and these types of wetlands are characterized by essentially just emergent vegetation that is non-woody, and under the Corps of Engineers 1987 Wetland Delineation Manual, there's certain data sheets that we have to fill out when we go out and delineate wetlands. And looking at this photo, we would just essentially go out and document the species that are present and then look for signs of water and then try to delineate those boundaries for determining the extent of those jurisdictional wetlands. And essentially, if this wetland was adjacent to a stream that in a typical year would overflow its banks and fill this wetland area and then recede, the jurisdiction would stop at the end of this wetland and not just the banks and ordinary high water mark of that stream. So the connectedness of the wetland feature to the stream is kind of what defines the extent of the jurisdiction of for Clean Water Act permitting for Modot projects. And some of the things for hydrology we look for are things such as standing water or water stained leaves, cracks in soil, or just lack of sparsely vegetated concave surfaces. Hydric soils can show signs of depletion and bacterial decay, and that changes the colors of the soil. And we've got manuals that essentially show us how to identify hydric soils. And then water-loving plants. Cattails are a common species that you can kind of see in this photo. Here's an example of a scrub shrub wetland, and typically these are defined by woody vegetation that's less than 20 feet tall. And in this photo, you can kind of see it looks like button bush and different shrubby vegetation, and there's also an emergent wetland component also out there. So this is just kind of showing the various types of wetlands. And here's an example of a forested wetland in Vernon County on Route F at Drywood Creek. This is dominated by trees greater than 20 feet, and you can see on the trees, if this wetland was dry and there was no water, you would be able to tell that it's a wetland by the buttressing or the swelling of the bases of these trees. And also another characteristic is just the water stains on the trees themselves. You can tell that where the high water mark is on the trees when sediment is deposited on some of those trees within the wetland. Here's an example of a farmed wetland, and this you can see by the arrowhead plant there in the middle of the picture. That's just one of the ones we look for. And then there's kind of a sparsely vegetated concave area with a little bit of water in the middle. And this is Holt County Route 159, and even though it is previously farmed, if left unfarmed, a lot of these areas can revert back to the conditions they were in prior to being farmed. This is another example of a jurisdictional water of the U.S. It's a scour hole on the Missouri River. I believe this is also Holt County Route 159, or maybe I think that's what the slide says. And there's also a large scour hole at the Missouri River on I-70 near Rocheport, Missouri. But essentially, scour holes can be considered jurisdictional, even though they are not connected with a flow channel to the Missouri River directly. If they do connect at some point during the season on a regular basis, those features would be regulated under 404 permitting. And this is just an example of a upland ditch, and a lot of times on project areas there are areas that do hold water for a significant portion of the year or even all year long and develop wetland vegetation, but ditches constructed in wetlands that are not connected to waters of the U.S. essentially are not jurisdictional. So a lot of times we get questions from maintenance about these features, or we'll have consultants that delineate features like this that are essentially aquatic vegetation areas or wetland areas in a project area that we have to go out and determine whether or not it's jurisdictional. But a ditch constructed in an upland is not jurisdictional. And this is Route 71 in Jackson County. So right now we just have like a little bit of a break. If you all want to stand up and stretch or get some water or whatever, you can do that now, and we'll get back to the next part of the presentation. And then hopefully a lot of this is making sense to you and to our friend Noah, and we'll continue learning about Clean Water Act permitting. Yeah, and the break will be 5 minutes, so be back here at 1:35.
Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. Accidentally hit a button on my headset. So what I was saying was I wanted to take a moment to introduce Caleb, who you just heard speaking for the past half hour or so. Caleb is our environmental specialist that covers wetlands for the Kansas City district and also wetlands and threatened and endangered species for the Southwest district. Caleb is transitioning his wetland duties over to Chris Hamilton for Kansas City, and you just heard Chris Hamilton speak earlier. At this time, I want to introduce Stephanie McLaren, who is our environmental specialist for wetlands and threatened and endangered species for the Central District. So she will be taking the next portion of the presentation, and at this point, I will start that back up again.
All right, so we've talked about what we go through when we get a project. We do our desktop review and we do field work if we need to. And then if we decide that the project needs a permit, we fill out the paperwork that we need to. So this is kind of just an overview of the most common permit types that we use and a little bit about what goes into actually obtaining those permits. But I guess first a little bit more background about the 404 permitting. The Clean Water Act, Section 404, explains that the Corps of Engineers administers the day-to-day permit program. So that's who we work with to apply for and get these permits. But the EPA actually has authority over the Corps. So I guess they can review projects that are permitted, and they can actually veto a permit that the Corps issues, but I don't think that's something that happens very commonly. That's it for that. Next slide. Earlier we mentioned that we have multiple Corps offices in Missouri that we work with, and this map shows the division of those offices. So Kansas City district makes up a good majority of the state. But there's actually a couple of different offices with Kansas City. There's one in Jeff City and one that's actually in Kansas City. Little Rock District, Memphis District, St. Louis District, and Rock Island District are the other ones. So there are some differences between the districts. Each office kind of has their own way of doing things. So we'll get permits from these different offices and they might look a little bit different between districts. I don't know how many of you see permits, but sometimes when they come in, the wording's just a little different. It also just, there's some differences in personalities and how the regulators are to work with between the offices. So some want a lot more detail than others. So that's why you might get a lot of questions from us requesting more detail, because we have an idea of who might be reviewing our permit application and what kind of information they're going to want to see. And sometimes it's better to have more information than not enough right off the bat, so that it's not, so you can get your permit faster rather than have it sit and then get more questions asked by the Corps. Makes sense. So 404 part is administered by the Corps. 401, the water quality certification that we talked about a little bit earlier, that's administered by the state. Missouri Department of Natural Resources deals with that. They also have the State Historic Preservation Office. This is kind of a side note, but it's also known as SHPO, and we have to deal with SHPO also when we're getting these permits, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then those are the two main agencies we deal with, the Corps and DNR, but then we could also be involved with Fish and Wildlife Service. If there's any endangered, threatened or endangered species in the area, we'll be working with them for that, because we cannot get a 404 permit without having those things cleared first. MDC might be contacted if we see records for state listed species. We contact them to see if they have any recommendations or concerns they want to express about a project. So sometimes we might get recommendations from them about things that they'd like to see us do as conservation measures. Then federal highways, we work with them because they provide the federal funding for our transportation projects. Then NRCS can also potentially be involved. For example, if there's a wetland reserve program property near a project, we might have to work with them. But a note on the Wetland Reserve Program, or WRP, if you ever see a comment in an RES about there being WRP property near the project, if you can do everything possible to avoid impacting it, that's the best scenario. I haven't had to deal with a project that impacts that, but I've heard that that's something that has to go to Washington, D.C. Like, it goes many levels through government to deal with impacts to one of those properties. So it's better if we can just avoid that. And then we might even have non-agency involvement with a project. So for certain types of permits, mainly individual 404 permits, which I'll talk about, the Corps will have a public notice go out for 30 days. Sometimes it can be shortened to 21 days. But this goes out on their website, so anybody can see a proposed project and submit comments on it. So when that happens, we see those comments when they come in, and we're required to respond to them. And that process that is one of the things that adds time to obtaining an individual permit. One of the things that makes it take longer. So I've thrown around these terms: individual permits or IPs, or nationwide permits, NWPs. Those are the two main types of permits that we get for 404. So the nationwide permit is a type of general permit that's available for projects that are similar in nature and are likely to have a minor effect on jurisdictional or regulated waters and wetlands. Right now, there's 54 different types of nationwide permits, and these permits cover various activities like transportation projects, utility line activities, cranberry production is on there, boat ramps. There's all kinds of things that are covered under these permits. And then on the other hand are the individual permits, and those are required for projects that have much more significant impact. They don't fall under the thresholds that are defined in a nationwide permit. So these are projects that are larger, more impactful, and the time it takes to obtain one of those permits is a lot longer than for nationwide. Fortunately for everybody, most of our projects are authorized by the nationwide permit. So most of the time we're dealing with projects that do not exceed a ½ acre of impacts to waters of the US. A lot of the time we don't have to even notify the Corps that a project is taking place. But if the project impacts over 1/10 of an acre of stream or wetlands, then we do have to submit a pre-construction notification and get a permit authorization. So, okay, and then if there is not that threshold of impacts that's met, then no PCN is required, and we do not have to submit anything to the Corps because those nationwide permits, they're kind of just there. Like the way to look at it is like you have this book of permits and you can just pick one and it applies to your project so long as you are within the, I guess, confines of the permit. And if you're a little bit, I don't know, it's tricky to explain. I feel like I'm not explaining it well. But anyways, when it falls under those certain thresholds, you don't need to submit anything to the Corps. You just have the permit already. And that's when we write our no PCN letters, which document that we have reviewed the project, we've determined it falls under the permit. And then when you're over certain thresholds, it's still under a nationwide, but you need to submit the notification. That's the best I can explain it. So a couple of the most common nationwide permits that we use at Modot. One is the nationwide permit 3 for maintenance activities. So this includes culvert repairs or rehabs, cleaning them out, fixing scour, bank work at bridge vents, sediment removal, things like that. Usually for these types of projects, based on the permit language that is provided, we don't need to have a PCN. The work just falls under that standard, just the permit as it is. There's no verification needed from the Corps. We're just good to go. We just type up our letter, the documentation, and that's all we have to do. Here's some examples of the sediment removal I mentioned that falls under that permit. I guess that upper left picture, that actually used to have 11 feet of clearance when that culvert was built. So you can see they had to go in there and remove sediment. And in situations like this, most of the time, it falls under a no PCN. But if there's something at that location that would trigger a PCN, then we might have to write one. So for scenarios like this, it's always good to just run it by us. Just call your environmental contact and let them know you have to do a clean out at this spot. They can do that quick desktop review and see if there's anything that would trigger a PCN or if it just falls under the permit with no notification of the Corps required. Nationwide permit 14 is for linear transportation projects. So we use that one when there's new or replacement bridges or culverts, or when there's culvert extensions. Depending on how you look at things, and yeah, depending on the regulator, it might cover bank stabilization along a roadway. The permit includes temporary construction access and dewatering that's necessary to complete the project. And then, yeah, like the 3, most of the time, or a lot of the time, we fall under nationwide permit 14 with no PCN to the Corps required. But if we're over 1/10 of an acre of impacts, we need to notify the Corps. And in this case, if there's any wetland impacts, even if it's below 1/10 of an acre, we need to notify them. So I've been talking about this pre-construction notification and different thresholds that require one. There's also some other triggers for PCN, even if you're not meeting the threshold. So let's say you're at a stream, you've got a less than 10th acre of impacts, there's no wetland impacts. Well, if it falls under one of these categories, a PCN would still be needed. So that includes streams or wetlands and priority watersheds, designated sensitive aquatic species waters, water that's a designated special aquatic resource, or designated an outstanding state or national resource water. Also, the lake, anything impacting Lake of the Ozarks requires a PCN. And then, like I mentioned in the last slide, if there's any impacts to wetlands, that requires a PCN. So as I mentioned, IPs are needed when the impacts of a project exceed the threshold of a PCN. So that's for projects that are over half an acre. In this example, this project has multiple stream crossings, and depending on the core district, a project like this might fall under an individual permit because they would consider all those impacts as cumulative. So if you have that many crossings that are impacted, that's probably going to exceed the half acre of impact. Or they might look at it like each crossing is its own project. So that kind of just depends on the district. It's my understanding. It's core discretion. So for the 401 certification from DNR, we kind of talked about this earlier. Modot has a memorandum of understanding with DNR so that DNR does not condition projects that are permitted under a nationwide permit. So anything that falls under a nationwide permit, we automatically have our 401 certification from DNR so long as we're adhering to the 9 stipulations that are in the MOU. There's actually a state statute that has this language in it that DNR can't do anything when we're under a nationwide permit. But for individual permits or IPs, we do need to go through that individual water quality certification process. And we need to get that 401 certification before we get our 404. So the process has recently changed and it's become a little more complicated and time-consuming. So I'll kind of go over that to give you an idea of what that looks like if you ever have to go through it. So we used to just submit the 404 permit to the Corps and to DNR at the same time. It would be kind of like they'd get the same information at the same time. But now 401 has to be done in advance of 404, and it takes a while because of this process that they have outlined. To begin, we have to submit a pre-filing meeting request, just saying that we want to request a 401. And then we'll have a meeting if one's needed, or if they have enough information up front, it may not be needed, but we have to submit this request. Then only after 30 days has passed, then we can request the actual certification. So there is no budging on that timeline. It's got to be at least 30 days after that request has been made before you can ask for the water quality cert. But it is okay to wait for a lot longer. If you need to wait several months before you make your request, that's fine. But you just can't do it less than 30 days from that request. Once you do request your water quality certification, you must have all your materials be submitted, because once that request is made, they start a timer basically on it, and they give themselves 60 days to get this to you. So if you don't have all the materials provided that are like just provide all the details necessary that can eat into that 60 days, and you might not get your water quality certification at the end of it. So that's 60 days isn't very much time when they have to have a 30-day public notice. And then they also have to respond to any of those comments that are received and then make their decision on if they're going to issue the certification, issue it with conditions, deny it, or waive it. So these are just the main things to keep in mind, I guess, for this new process. We could still apply for the 401 when the 404 is applied for, but the application has changed somewhat. And the last time I went through this, I think the 401, I can't remember the order it happened, but I still gave them the information. But it's a different process than it was, because you have to have that language and pre-filing meeting request and all that. Keep in mind there's that 60-day time limit, so don't request the certification until after 30 days has passed is the meeting request, and don't request it so soon that not enough details about the project are known yet. So I just want to know that we can't blame DNR for this. This is something that the EPA developed, and they just have to go along with these regulations. So. And a note about design build projects, because they're kind of special and different than our just regular STIP projects or maintenance projects. It's more difficult to permit these kinds of projects because the details aren't known. When we're getting these permits, the whole process assumes that you know what is happening with the project, but with design build, we don't know until later. But you need to have your permits before you can do the work, and it's just it's difficult to work around. So that's why it's really important when there's a design build project that you include environmental staff if there are any significant issues with the project, because it is so difficult to go through this process for these projects, because the process is not built with these kinds of projects in mind. Yeah, the big takeaway in this, it's very important to have coordination with us and have it early and often. Yes, that's mine. Okay, so you're all getting tired of hearing about permits, but we have some more to talk about. So Caleb's going to talk about some permit conditions that are important to remember.
All right, thanks, Stephanie. So kind of going into this next part of the presentation, I'm just going to talk about the permit conditions. So these apply to all of our nationwide permits and individual permits, with the exception of the MOU conditions. Those only apply to nationwide permits, and kind of that process Stephanie talked about. The individual 401 conditions can apply to those individual permits. There's a lot of overlap between the Section 401 MOU conditions, the Section 404 general conditions, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit in a few slides. There's Missouri regional conditions that we have to abide by when we have nationwide permits and on the projects that impact waters of the U.S. And then sometimes there's even permit specific conditions. So beyond all of these conditions that you have to follow, they can add conditions. So as you can see, there's a lot of stuff we have to ensure that the contractors are following whenever we have projects with conditions. And if a contractor's worked with Modot before or maintenance, they're typically fairly familiar with these conditions, and all of them can be found in the Modot spec book. And we'll kind of get into some of these. This next slide just kind of shows the MOU conditions, and I don't want to go through all of these. I just wanted to highlight number 3 mainly, but they all do apply. But essentially, talking about suitable material, when you have a project, it kind of specifies if it's under a nationwide permit and you're putting fill material in the waters of the U.S., you cannot use earthen, fill, gravel, fragmented asphalt, broken concrete with exposed rebar, large slabs of unbroken concrete, tires, vehicle bodies, liquid concrete, including grouted riprap, or any materials containing chemical pollutants. These MOU conditions and that one specifically just kind of outline what you can or what you cannot use when constructing a project. And just another note on that is that we're going to be revising those conditions with MDNR at the end of the year, and there will be some minor changes, but for the most part, those unsuitable materials will stay the same. So general conditions, nationwide permits are subject to these general conditions, and they include but are not limited to, this one is general condition 2, which is aquatic life movement. So temporary and permanent crossings shall be sufficiently culverted or bridged or constructed to maintain low flows and sustain aquatic life movement. And here's an example of a box culvert that's perched that has a drop of 1 or 2 feet, and essentially aquatic organisms cannot overcome that barrier. So anything upstream of that box culvert will not be able to, essentially there won't be any passage of aquatic organisms. So when this structure is replaced, it would be required that a new structure would not have this same drop. General condition 3 just references spawning areas, and so activities in spawning areas must be avoided during the spawning season. And I'll show you a map later on of some spawning restriction streams and different things we look at to show us where those restrictions are in place. And typically they're in the spring. A lot of streams are March 15th to June 15th, but depending on the aquatic organisms and the stream you're in, those can vary, and we try to place job special provisions in the contracts to notify the contractors of those requirements. General condition 9 just talks about management of water flows, and temporary crossings must be constructed to withstand expected high flows and must not impede aquatic organism passages. And this is an example of some good temporary crossings that you can see are maintaining those flows, and there's no drops and there's no impoundment of water upstream of those crossings. General condition 6 talks about suitable material. Earlier I referenced the Missouri 401 water quality certification conditions, but this is a 404 permit condition, and so there's a little bit of overlap in that. Suitable materials such as trash, debris, asphalt, car bodies shall not be used. And here's just a photo of an example of unsuitable unbroken slabs that are placed in the near the culvert in an attempt to reduce erosion and stop the water from eroding the structure. And a lot of the problem with the large slabs is that the water can still erode around the edges, and then it just takes away the sediment behind the structure or behind the slab, and then they fall into the stream. And if these are all grouted together with concrete, that can cause especially harmful problems to the structure and aquatic organisms or the traveling public, where the whole structure fails at one time, being all tied together in this fashion. General condition 11 just talks about equipment movement. Heavy equipment must be placed on mats or other measures be taken to minimize soil disturbance. Here's a picture of a lift operating on a timber mat in a wetland area that was determined. This project required a 404 permitting and was a bridge rehab. And essentially they are displacing the weight of that equipment on that mat, so it's not compacting the soil, limiting vegetation growth in that wetland. General Condition 12 talks about soil and sediment controls. Soil erosion and sediment controls must be used, and work below ordinary high water must be permanently stabilized as soon as possible. So essentially, this condition just talks about implementing BMPs and then stabilizing the soil below ordinary high water if you're working in wetlands or waters of the U.S. And those must be done as soon as possible during project construction. And here's a pretty good example of looks like some ditch checks and some stabilization measures. General Condition 13 talks about removals of temporary fills, and just states that temporary fills must be removed in their entirety and affected areas returned to pre-construction elevations. So in this example, this bridge was a rehab, and essentially there was temporary construction and work pads below the bridge. As you can see on the picture in the left, there's wetlands below that bridge and kind of an open water, sparsely vegetated concave surface that was a fairly decent site as far as wetlands go. But with the construction of that bridge required placement of temporary work pads, and then the requirement is for that general condition just that those materials be removed in that area, be either regraded or returned to pre-construction elevation. General Condition 23 talks about mitigation, and so essentially this one says that you must avoid and minimize impacts to the maximum extent practical. So when we're reviewing projects on the RES system, like Chris talked about earlier, and we see that there's slope limits or things that they could be tightened up, or different things done in design, or just even moving certain structures, we may ask about that, but typically we just ensure that if that is not possible, to avoid those impacts to the maximum extent practical, that we mitigate for those impacts in certain situations. And typically that is required for impacts over 1/10 of an acre. Just some more conditions. Like I said, there are a lot of conditions on top of all the things that we look for and do in the 404 permitting, but General Condition 30 just requires that this compliance certification is signed by the resident engineer at the end of the project. And this is essentially to certify that the project was completed in accordance to all those conditions I just mentioned, and any special conditions were followed in the permit. And when that's signed, it's sent or scanned or emailed back to the environmental specialist, and then we forward that on to the Corps. And I think there has been instances where the RE will just send it to the regulator that issued the permit. But we like to document those with the project as well, so we just know that when the project is finished. So some regional conditions, and these are mainly for our screening purposes. When we're looking at projects, stream crossings in regards to culvert embedment, seasonal restrictions, like I mentioned earlier, we must follow General Condition 3 and Regional Condition 2 that talk about stream restriction dates. Invasive aquatic species, so certain plants aren't allowed to be used that are invasive. Suitable material must follow General Condition 6 and Regional Condition 2, as well as the Missouri Regional or MOU conditions. Priority watersheds require notifications for work in a priority watershed, and then special aquatic sites require PCN, and sensitive aquatic species require PCN. And here's just a map showing all of those resources we have throughout the state. As you can see, there's quite a few. So Regional Condition 1 just talks about culvert embedment, and essentially culverts must be embedded at least 1 foot if they're greater than 48 inches. If they're less than 48 inches, they must be placed at grade. And then in non-erodible stream beds, culverts don't need to be embedded. Highly erodible stream beds may require additional embedment. And like I said, this is just an example of unsuitable material that you wouldn't want to put in a project when you're designing it or doing maintenance on a project. And I did mention that special conditions can be placed in a project. And this is just an example of, there was 2 pages in this specific permit for a design build, or not a design build, but for a project that was the large I-49 project in Southwest Missouri. So if that wasn't enough, there's more regulations on top of that that we're going to get into a little bit. So some other things that apply that we've alluded to a little bit are just Section 408 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, or Section 14 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. That's 33 USC 408, but commonly referred to as Section 408. And these permissions are required when there's alteration or occupation or use of USACE structures. These can include navigable waters, levees, gateway structures, grade control structures, or various saying the Section 408 is required for projects that alter or occupy federally constructed projects. And essentially this requires a 408 permission letter from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They have a levee database online that can be used to look up these structures and help determine if a 408 is required. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is also contacted by us to verify the accuracy of the levee database. The need of a 408 permission is greatly increases the amount of time we need to get our permits. So it's essential that we have early coordination on projects that could require 408s. Here's just an example of a typical leveed system, maybe on the Missouri River or the Mississippi River. Even if you are not occupying or impacting the levee itself or the channel, there could be a levee safety review required, and we need to get verification from them that the project is good to go, even if there are no direct impacts. This is just kind of a fact sheet showing Section 408 just requirements and information. We're not going to go through all of this, but just kind of showing just a general overview of what we look at and describing what 408 is. Here's an example of the National Levee Database that is what we look at for projects. And as you can see, along the Missouri and Mississippi River, and then various areas elsewhere in Missouri, specifically in southeast Missouri, there are federally constructed levees and systems that require Section 408 permitting, but primarily the requirement is applied when we're working near Missouri and Mississippi rivers. So Chris Hamilton's going to take over from here and talk about some additional requirements for Modot projects.
Thanks, Caleb.
So,
the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, we typically will take a look at projects that might be impacting. We're getting some feedback here, sorry. All right. Typically, when we get these projects in, as we looked at before in the RES, another section in the RES is the T&E section. When we look at the RES, we might have tree clearing. That's what we talked about before. We might have impacts to Indiana northern long-eared bats, also great bats if we're near cave resources. The northern long-eared bat is what's pictured here. We also take a look at trees. This is what we would consider a bat tree, and that's why we're concerned with tree clearing limits. We get our species lists from the information for planning and consultation, or IPAC. These species lists are generated based on the project areas. Almost all RESs, when we fill out our species lists, are going to have Indian and northern long-eared bats. They're not going to always have gray bats. A new species that you might see popping up is the monarch butterfly. This hasn't been listed, but it is currently considered a candidate species, so we will just mention those. Other species that might show up in project areas are federally listed mussels, and these mussels typically come along with regional conditions, 7 listed streams, as we took a look at when we were looking at the desktop screening earlier. The next section that we take a look at, and this section is not something that Caleb, Stephanie, and I look at. We actually have other staff in our office that review these projects for Section 106 Cultural Resources. They are the ones who will consult with SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. There's a segment of this that will go into our permit applications. So typically, when we fill out our permit applications, there are segments. Each segment has a statement in it, and usually we, in the Section 106 section, we'll put in a statement saying what was determined at this site, and if we're going to be impacting areas that might be of historic preservation concern. The Section 404 permit will not be issued until we have concurrence from SHPO. So now we're going to pass it over to Stephanie to talk about mitigation on our projects.
All right. So let's say we got all through that. You got your permit application in, the delineation's done, you have your T&E taken care of, consultations done with Fish and Wildlife, you have your SHPO clearance letter for 106. Then you might be looking at mitigation for your project. So compensatory mitigation is to provide compensation for unavoidable impacts to streams or wetlands. And it might be required when you are over 1/10 of an acre of impacts for your project. This is a picture of Bear Creek mitigation area in Macon County. This was site-specific mitigation for Route 36. Next to it, I don't know if it's in the picture, but Bear Creek Mitigation Bank is, oh, it's just out of the picture. When is mitigation required? It's typically required when permanent impacts to streams or wetlands exceed 1/10 of an acre. But sometimes temporary impacts may also require mitigation depending on the extent of impacts, the duration of the impacts, the type of resource that is impacted, and the Corps office that is permitting the project. And if it's determined that mitigation is required, it will be included as a condition of the 404 permit. Before mitigation, the idea is to avoid it if at all possible. So if the project looks like it's impacting an area, if there's anything that can be done to avoid impacts or minimize impacts, that's what we need to try to do. And then if we still can't avoid or minimize completely eliminating the impacts, then we have to have mitigation. So this is just an example of an older project, I think. This was Route 67 corridor in Southeast District. In the area of the project, there was actually a rare type of wetland known as a fen wetland. So the initial preferred alignment was actually right through the wetland, but because it would have had so much impact, it would have cost so much money for mitigation. There's an endangered species that is known to use this type of wetland. There weren't records at this particular location, but it's a habitat that was suitable for it. It just was going to cost so much to mitigate that it worked out better to just avoid the feature, and the lanes were moved to the east of the existing roadway instead of to the west. And so that area was saved and eventually sold. Another example of avoidance and minimization would be the addition of 2-foot shoulders instead of 10-foot shoulders in order to minimize or avoid wetland impacts. Nowadays, most mitigation is fulfilled through the use of mitigation banks. Modot actually has some banks that were created, developed by Modot and are owned by Modot. And those banks have a credit ledger, and when project takes place in the watershed with that bank, we can just deduct credits from that ledger and our mitigation is good. Privately owned banks, are the other option. These are ones that are not owned by us, and we just purchase credits from the bank owner. I mentioned Modot has some of, we own some of our own banks, and this map shows where those are located. The stars show, well, we actually have some stream banks also, but the stars show where there's different types of mitigation banks, and those red lines on the map show the boundaries of the watershed. So if you have a project that takes place within the same area as where a bank is located, you'd be able to use that bank. Of course, the final say is by the Corps, but typically you'd be able to use that bank for mitigation for your project if mitigation is needed. The other commonly used form of mitigation besides mitigation bank is in lieu fee programs. In lieu fee mitigation involves the payment paid by the permittee to a program sponsor. In Missouri, we have 2 major nonprofit in lieu fee sponsors or providers. One is the Land Learning Foundation, and the other is the Stream Stewardship Trust Fund that is administered by Missouri Conservation Heritage Foundation. So basically, we provide payment to these providers just like we would for a bank, but it's a little bit different because their projects might not be completed yet, and that funding is used for projects that they're working on or planning on. Another option, though rarely used anymore, is on-site mitigation. This actually used to be common practice, but it's shifted towards the use of banks and in lieu fee programs. That's what's preferred by the Corps, and it's also actually easier on us too, because these mitigation areas require maintenance, and we have quite a few throughout the state that were created with past projects that we still own. So right now, while it was once common, it's rare and the last resort only when the other options aren't available is when we would use this. This sign here that you see on the PowerPoint, if you come across one of those signs when you're out surveying or at a field site for a project, that means that there is some type of mitigation site near the area or at that area. So please contact us if you come across that, because for all these areas, the other thing about these areas is we really don't want to impact them once they are a mitigation site, because the mitigation is expensive. So anyways, if you come across one of these signs, please let us know, but we also have resources we can look at in the office to see if there is one in a project area. So mitigation costs can vary greatly depending on the amount and type of mitigation required. There's 2 methods that are used to calculate mitigation requirements: Missouri Stream Mitigation Method for stream impacts, the Missouri Wetland Mitigation Method for wetland impacts. And to use those, there's just different factors. Yeah, I see that. There's different factors that are used to make these calculations. We just have to follow this method. And we might come up with a number, but the Corps has the final say on what the mitigation requirement is. So we might have some idea, but they might say we need a little more or a little fewer credits than what we calculated. So this is just showing a tool that we have to use to find mitigation banks in an area. If we don't have anything, the Corps has this website where you can look up where your project is and see what mitigation bank or in lieu fee program providers there are in the watershed, that, and you can see how many credits they have available and contact information, things like that. So that's just showing just a couple of examples of what that looks like. So Chris is going to take over this.
All right, thank you all very much. So we're nearing the end of the presentation, and we just have a few more important points to go over. And our friend Noah, after setting through all this, is happy now. He understands a little better about how to deal with the wetlands that are identified on his RES. And so hopefully you all out there have a little better idea of how to deal with those as well. So getting into the points to remember: coordination with us, with our office. Please submit RESs and provide additional information if it's requested by our staff. Sometimes it's it can be taken care of in a phone call, but oftentimes we'll ask for an RES to be submitted, especially if there's been a significant change in a project, and we want to make sure that everyone in our office that reviews these gets a chance to comment and make sure there are no additional concerns. Please include our specialists on core team meeting invitations, particularly for projects with a known wetland or endangered species concern, so that we can explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, and get your questions answered, and also give our staff a chance to ask questions. Please include our specialists on pre-construction meetings when that's necessary. So oftentimes we might have a job special provision that maybe needs a little bit of explanation to the contractor, just so everybody's on the same page. It's just a good practice to make sure that someone from our office that is familiar with that job special provision can answer questions that the contractor may have, and can also just fill in some of those details that may not always come across in a job special. So for projects with a 404 permit, when you get those permits, they have the work completion certification, the compliance certification. Make sure that those get signed by the resident engineers after the project is completed, and we'll get those sent off to the Corps. So all you REs out there, make sure that you get that back to the wetland specialist in your respective district. When to contact our office. If you have change orders during construction that are related to drainage structures or protection of structures, make sure you get in touch with us. Anytime that there's a change in the plan when a 404 permit has been issued, every 404 permit, I think, has a statement in there that says that these the permit is based upon submitted plans. And so if the plans change and we haven't notified the Corps, we could be in violation of that permit. So please make sure that you notify us of any changes. Anytime there's any equipment in a stream or wetland for any maintenance activities, our office wants to be notified. Sometimes those types of activities don't require a permit, but we want to get a chance to find out what you're wanting to do and make sure that that we keep in compliance with all regulations. Stephanie already talked a little bit about these sensitive areas signs, so make sure you contact us if you see one of these, and we can hopefully answer what it's for and what you can and can't do beyond what it states on the sign. We work to protect the environmental resources because of the valuable services they provide, and also to comply with federal and state laws. And that the funding that we receive is dependent on those funds or on those laws and complying with those laws. And so if we don't comply with those laws, we may lose our funding. There's been instances where we have not complied and Federal Highways has said to stop a project. We definitely don't want that to happen. So please contact our office if things come up. Our environmental specialists are here to help keep your projects on schedule and completing the necessary paperwork and securing necessary permits before PS&E. The more complex the project, the earlier coordination that needs to take place. Environmental regulations can change over time. Modot Environmental keeps track of regulation changes that affect Modot projects. We've been talking about not only 404, but 401 today, and we talked about waters of the U.S., and I think Caleb mentioned a recent court case in Arizona. So, you know, we had a definition of the waters of the U.S. that applied prior to 2015 based on a couple of Supreme Court cases. After 2015, another water of the U.S. rule came into effect that was only in effect in parts of the country. And then the previous administration had rescinded that definition, came up with a different definition, and just this past couple of weeks, that definition was rescinded, and now we're back to 2015. So these things are moving targets. 401, the water quality certification, that's the same sort of thing. The process that Stephanie described earlier is being reviewed by the current administration, and those changes may be rescinded in part or in whole. So we are keeping track of all of that, and please forgive us for the constant changing regulatory world. It's not our fault. We do our best to try to keep up with it and to try to keep your projects moving. But you can always feel free to call our office with questions. We're here to serve you. And here is our assignments. Of course, I'm the Environmental Compliance Manager for Wetlands and T&E. Stephanie has Central District. Georgianne Bowman, who is on vacation now for 2 weeks, she has Southeast. Chris Hamilton has Wetlands for St. Louis and Kansas City, and also T&E for St. Louis. And Caleb has both T&E and Wetlands for Southwest. And Sammy Ostman, who is also on vacation, has Northwest and Northeast. So if we have any time for any questions, if we have any in the chat, I can't see the chat right now.
Yeah, Chris,
sharing.
Chris, there is a question in the chat. Says, with the potential for wetlands to appear and disappear.
Kenny, I think you're muted. Maybe it's me. It's me. I can't get used to this headset. Sorry. Were you saying something, Kenny?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. That's me. Sorry.
All right. Okay. So we do have a question in the chat pod. Says, with the potential for wetlands to appear and disappear, how often are the maps updated?
So the maps, the NWI mapping is way out of date. If that's what you're referring to, the questioner is referring to. We use that as just sort of an indicator of what may be out there. Oftentimes it's wrong, but it gives us an indication of whether or not we need to go in the field. And those other resources Chris mentioned, soils maps, aerial photos, those sorts of things, we use all that in our desktop review. There is an effort to update NWI maps, but it is very, very expensive to do so, in the millions and millions of dollars. But we have been partnering with other state and federal agencies during meetings to discuss how Modot can be involved with those efforts.
So I don't see any other questions in the chat pod, but I want to open it up to anybody that wants to ask a verbal question. You can raise your hand in WebEx. But while we're waiting for people to raise their hand, I did have a question that kind of came up last week, Chris. Was whenever sometimes a district might want to accelerate a project, or maybe a project's being delayed, but it's not, it takes a while for the STIP to be updated. What's the best way for them to communicate to your staff on those kind of changes?
Best way is as soon as possible, and as soon as they're even thinking about that, to get in touch with either any of us really in the office, but particularly the managers, Melissa, myself, Mike, Minecove, you know, and have that discussion with us so that we can make sure that our staff is informed that they need to be looking at those projects and planning their field work and prioritizing accordingly.
And the reason why they have to call or contact you is because the RES form is really based on what's in the STIP, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And our specialists look at those RESs. They're keying in on A dates, PS&E, letting, those types of things in order to prioritize their work.
Charlotte, do you see anybody that has their hand raised?
There was a
No,
question at the beginning of the presentation about, for the 404 permit, the waters of the United States in regard to fill placed in the water assumes the ordinary high water mark as the start of that boundary, correct? And I just wanted to say, yes, that is correct. We're wanting to know what the fill is below ordinary high water because that's what is under jurisdiction of the Corps. Anything above that, though, would be considered upland and not subject to permitting.
I'll also mention too, in addition to that, that ordinary high water, based on the Corps' definition, can sometimes vary based on, it's sometimes different than what may be on a set of bridge plans. Oftentimes what we are looking for, again, I refer back to that slide that shows the line where vegetation starts on the stream bank. So anything below that line is what we're interested in reporting to the Corps. So a lot of times that's lower in elevation than what we see as is shown on bridge plans.
okay, I do not see any raised hands.
Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and close the webinar then. If we didn't get to your questions on this topic today, please reach out to any of today's presenters. I hope today's presentation provided a better understanding of the Clean Water Act. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We appreciate any feedback on how we can improve this format or the content of future webinars. As we wrap up this webinar, we will be registering your participation in Modot U. The WebEx system allows us to track who is attending by computer, but we do not know who may be attending as part of a group or by call. If you are in attendance but not signed into WebEx, please contact Charlotte by email so that we can give you a credit for today's training. Thank you, and wanted to remind everyone that Shelley Daniel is sending out regular emails regarding the webinar series that we have out there, and has the list of future webinars that are coming. And then she also tries to add links to add you so that you can easily go back to those that you maybe didn't get to attend in person. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for your participation.